It rises every morning, and so do we. With fresh perspectives and innovative ideas, we grow trust for our clients in food and agriculture, in their products, processes, people, and brands. It's all we do, and we do it like no one else can. It's a new day in food and agriculture, with new challenges and bright possibilities. When you need someone you can count on, look east.
Thank you for joining us today at Agri-Pulse.com. I'm Spencer Chase with Agri-Pulse Communications, joined today by Jim Webster, who is also with Agri-Pulse and kind of a elder statesman and really a senior member of the Agri-Pulse Communications team. And we're really excited to roll out a new project that we're going to be doing here at Agri-Pulse Communications. And Jim is really playing an integral role in really from the founding of this project more than 15 years ago. A lot of you may know that are subscribers to our Agri-Pulse newsletter, the Farmhands on the Potomac section of our newsletter is really one of the more popular sections of the piece, and that's the place where we kind of detail the comings and goings on Capitol Hill, K Street, and whatnot, and really see where the folks that are working in DC, where they're headed, where they've been, the new job postings, things of that nature. And that was something that Jim had started with the Webster Agricultural Letter many years ago. So we thought we'd bring Jim on to kind of preempt and kind of talk about what this project is going to be like, some of Jim's history in Washington, as well as just the Farmhands on the Potomac section as a whole. So Jim, for starters, appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Glad to be here.
So can you take us kind of through your greater employment history, kind of the timeline of, as far back as you'd like to go, kind of explaining your history throughout Washington, D.C.?
Well, through Washington, that started in 1970. I came here from South Dakota, where I was editing a small paper and working for UPI, and came here to work for the American Public Power Association. Then I got involved in politics, went to work for Senator George McGovern as his legislative assistant and press secretary, went to the Senate Agriculture Committee, then to USDA in the Carter administration. I left that in 1981 and started a newsletter. And one of the things that we did in that newsletter was to tell the stories of where the people who were leaving the government were going to jobs and who the new people were coming in. It was originally called The Grapevine in that newsletter, and then later on, when the Webster Agricultural Letter was born, it was rechristened as Farmhands on the Potomac, and Webster Agricultural Letter became part of Agri-Pulse in 2007, and Farmhands came with it.
And so we'll circle back to Farmhands on the Potomac a little bit later in our talk, but I want to talk a little bit about you and your personal experience in Washington for starters. You spent some time working in the Senate, working on the Senate Agricultural Committee, and you've obviously still kept in touch and kept apprised of what's going on with that committee today. How would you compare your time on the committee with the committee goings-on of today?
Well, there's really no comparison between what happened in, say, 1973, 4, 5, 6, 7, when I was working there. We had a staff of about a dozen in the Senate Agriculture Committee. It's probably triple that today. The House Agriculture Committee is even larger. The proliferation of staff in Congress has been one of the remarkable changes over that period of time. I'll leave it to others to decide whether that's good or bad. But it does seem to take longer and become more difficult to get legislation out today than it was in, say, the 1973 Farm Bill, which we probably passed by September after starting out in February without a lot of real difficult fights.
So what do you really think was the defining moment when you think of your time with Senate Ag? What's the biggest memory that comes to mind for you?
Well, the biggest memory, of course, was passage of the 73 Farm Bill, followed by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission Act and the Grain Inspection Act. We were reformed in the 4 years that I was on the Hill, both futures trading, regulation, and grain inspection, reacting to scandals or perceived scandals that took place in the markets and in the inspection system. Then going to USDA, I was in charge of congressional liaison and public affairs. We had a whole lot to deal with. The biggest one, of course, was the embargo. And how did we sell the embargo to after Russia invaded Afghanistan and Carter embargoed the sale of grain and wheat and oilseeds to the Soviet Union? Was a very difficult time for American agriculture, and we had to go get through that.
And let's talk about that for a little bit, because I'm sure anyone that's been following American agriculture for a long time, you say the 1980s and they kind of get a chill down their spine a little bit. I mean, that was not a good time for the American agricultural industry in a lot of different commodity areas. So when you guys were working within the Department of Agriculture, you said you left in 81, so that's really before the 1980s became the 1980s in terms of American agriculture. I mean, could you guys see it coming? I mean, did you know there was something on the horizon there?
A few people thought they did, say they did in retrospect, but mostly not. Nobody really in mainstream agriculture predicted the kind of a bust in farmland prices and asset losses that we went through in the 1980s. Starting a newsletter business in 1981, in retrospect, was not a very good time to do it in agriculture because we were in a very difficult time financially. Agribusiness profits were way down because farm income was way down. We managed to somehow get through that, though, and build over the years, but it was a very difficult time. At one point, we started a separate newsletter called the Agricultural Credit Letter, just to cover the demise of country banks and what was going on with Farmers Home Administration, now part of FSA. It was a very difficult time. There were suicides of farmers. There was even the killing of a banker by a disgruntled barber one time. So it was a very difficult time financially and emotionally for agriculture, and the sector, of course, got through it and got to prosper, but it's one of those cyclical things, and that was the low point of one of the cycles for sure.
Now, when you were with Senate Ag, with USDA, were you in the press shops or communications office at both of those both places there?
Yes, I was press secretary for Senator McGovern for 1 year. Then I was press secretary and chief clerk for the Senate Agriculture Committee. And then I went to USDA, became assistant secretary for what was called governmental and public affairs. We had the public information shop as well as congressional liaison.
So obviously the lobbying outfits and things of that nature are a lot different now than they were back then. But what was it that made you take the turn when you left USDA and when you left the Hill? What was it that made you take the turn into journalism rather than going into lobbying, into communications for a potentially more lucrative career?
Yeah, certainly it would have been, but there weren't a lot of lobbying jobs open. And journalism was my beginning. I mean, I started out in my dad's weekly newspaper in Nebraska. I worked for AP as a copy boy, UPI in South Dakota and Wisconsin. So that was my original roots anyway. It occurred to me that here I had been for the last 8 years, 4 in Congress, congressional staff, 4 in USDA, telling people what was going on. But I wasn't being paid for it other than my salary. I wonder if they would be willing to pay me outside to explain to them the intricacies of what was going on in agricultural policy and politics. And it was successful.
So obviously the coverage of agriculture is very different now than it was at that point. But what do you think is more responsible for that? Is it the advent of technology within journalism, where I can post a tweet and it's out there into the world almost instantaneously, whereas back in the day there was a print issue that went out and sometimes the news was a little bit more dated? Or do you think some of the farmer technology and some of the things that the farmers have to do in order to maintain their own operations, and maybe agriculture has become a little bit more expansive as a result of that? What do you think is maybe the more driving force behind the change of how agriculture is covered?
Well, agriculture in 1970 probably made up 10% of the population. Every newspaper in middle part of the country and in the South had a Washington correspondent, a Washington bureau. Within USDA, there were probably a dozen news organizations had a full-time person with an office in USDA. That's almost disappeared. Agri-Pulse is one of the very few with offices within USDA. The New York Times doesn't cover it on a regular basis. The Washington Post doesn't. Even the Des Moines Register, which won Pulitzer Prizes for covering agriculture in those days, doesn't give the attention to agriculture because it's really such a small part of the population, even though it's a large part of the economy. So that, and of course the changes in technology. In those days, we would distribute press releases by putting them on a telecopier machine and sending them out on a slow roller to newspapers and radio stations around the country. Today, it's all instantaneous.
Mm-hmm. Certainly makes my job a little bit easier. I can't imagine how much more difficult it would have been back relying with the older technology.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about your specific publications. What did you really think was? I mean, did you have a specialty? Were you covering general agriculture? What did you think was kind of your niche within your publishing?
Well, it wasn't general agriculture. I mean, I'm not an agriculturalist. I have no studies in agronomy or economics. It was really agricultural politics, agricultural policy. What goes on in Washington that affects farm prices and farm income and affects consolidation in agriculture and agribusiness? Those are the specialties that I thought we should cover. And we started the newsletter with covering, the slogan was covering the politics, policy, and people of American agriculture in Washington. And sort of stuck with that. That sort of has been blended into Agri-Pulse, although Agri-Pulse is much broader with a much more technical capability covering agriculture that we didn't have in the old days of the newsletters.
So you've been covering agriculture as a journalist for quite some time, but in a specific newsletter capacity since '81, you said?
1981,
okay.
The newsletter.
So what's kind of do you have a favorite story that you've written over the time, or maybe a favorite topic, or a most important topic you think you've covered over the course of those years?
I think the most important thing I've covered is the biotechnology revolution from the policy standpoint and the regulation standpoint. I was an early believer in biotechnology when a former undersecretary or assistant secretary for research at USDA convinced me that this was just a more precise way of breeding. And I have been quite distressed to see the opposition build up to biotechnology, which is just another tool, an important tool, both for farmers to improve their incomes, improve the way they farm, improve the environment, use less invasive chemicals, and just generally do a better job. And it's been distressing to see over the years that I've covered it, I think, quite extensively, the difficulty that biotechnology has faced right up until now, and it's not over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, familiar viewers of Agri-Pulse videos will know that Phil Brasher and I have discussed the GMO labeling debate kind of ad nauseum here on Capitol Hill, and they've got a bill produced now. President Obama has signed it, but now we're going to USDA rulemaking, and I mean, if we thought the lobbying fight on Capitol Hill was interesting, who knows what we're going to see in terms of trying to influence the Department of Agriculture's rulemaking there. What
this is going to be with the rulemaking process is 10 times greater than the debate over organic standards under Secretary Glickman when he proposed allowing genetically modified organisms, sewage sludge, and one other factor into that. There were 250,000 emails to the department, probably the biggest at that time opposition to something, and they backed down, changed it. And this will be 10 times or 100 times larger, the lobbying pressure that is going to be put on USDA to get it right, to come up with the disclosure, whether it's labeling, QR codes, 800 numbers, whatever it is, and how GE products are determined, whether it's presence of a GE material or other factors.
Well, and I think a symptom of this is whether or not the folks that are maybe not actually involved in production agriculture are starting to pay attention to agricultural production. And I mean, I think there's a legitimate conversation to be had about whether or not they're accurately informed about the benefits or potential issues surrounding biotechnology. But do you think that we're just seeing, you mentioned the drop in population of folks that are actually farming, but do you think we're seeing a greater interest in the business, in the production of farming, maybe by people that have yet to set foot on a farm but still want to know, still want to have more information about the food they're eating?
Well, I think there is some of that, but the downside of it is that there's a lot of people that really don't have information, and they don't want information. They just want to oppose. Trade is another issue in the same vein. The evidence shows that trade may have some, trade agreements may have had some contribution to job losses in manufacturing, but the facts and the evidence is that it's been automation, robotics, things like that. We're actually much better off with trade, but there's a whole cadre of people that doesn't want to believe that. Same with biotechnology and industrial agriculture, commercial type farming. They just don't want to see the evidence. They just want to oppose it, and but it does raise the debate, and farmers and their allies need to continue standing up and making their case for it too.
And let's wrap up here with talking about the Farmhands on the Potomac section of the newsletter that you had been writing for so many years. I know in conversations with Agri-Pulse readers that I continually hear that that's one of their favorite portions of the newsletter, sort of Washington D.C. agriculture's gossip column, if you will. I like to think there's a little higher standard for it than that. But what was it that made you decide that this was something way back when? This was something that was worth covering.
It really goes back to my origins in a weekly newspaper my parents owned. They had all kinds of local stories about what people were doing. And agricultural Washington is a small town. Everybody knows everybody else. I mean, it really is. And this became the weekly newspaper of Washington agriculture. Subscribers would tell me that they always read it from the back to the front, because it was always on the back page of the print newsletter. And I think that's probably still true today, that a lot of people jump to the back of the story before they read the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's important from a context perspective to know that maybe a lobbyist that's working for Ag Organization X spent some time at USDA during a certain president's administration, and how that might influence their thinking and their policy making? I mean, do you think there's important context to be added as well?
Well, it is, and subscribers like to know who they're dealing with. I've had subscribers say, it's really important for me to know who the assistant to the undersecretary is, and so someone I can talk to when I have a problem at the USDA, or a problem at EPA, or a problem with FDA.
Mm-hmm. Certainly a lot of interesting things that have come as a result of our Farmhands on the Potomac coverage, and I think you're going to be very interested to see the results and the interviews that we're going to have as a part of this Meet the Farmhands project that we're going to be working on. Have a few interviews lined up. I don't want to divulge too much information at this point, because hopefully we'll be able to secure some more, but I think it'll be very interesting to meet not necessarily the policies that these people are working on, but the people themselves. What do they do on the weekends? What are their hobbies? What really got them into agricultural lobbying? And I think that's going to provide some interesting context for some of the conversations that are going to be going on around Washington, particularly around GMO labeling, the 2018 Farm Bill, things of that nature. A lot of news coming toward you in the coming years, and hopefully we at Agri-Pulse Communications will be able to bring you that information up to date. So Jim, I certainly want to appreciate you. Thank you for coming into DC today, sitting down and kind of giving us a little bit of history about yourself, about the Webster Agricultural Letter, about the Farmhands on the Potomac as well.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
For Jim Webster, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.